Welcome to the Herpcore History podcast, presented to you by Little Shop of Horrors. Feel free to reach out to us on any of our social media platforms for any of your feeder needs. All right, let's go ahead and get into this episode. All right, tonight I am joined by Paul Bodnar. He was nice enough to join me tonight and discuss his life in herpetoculture. How's it going, Paul?
Oh, excellent, Lewis. Thank you so much for having the time to discuss reptiles and all the interesting things that surround those.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I'm looking forward to our conversation. So, where'd you grow up at?
Well, I'm a Cleveland native. I was born and bred in Cleveland, Ohio. I'm 50 years old this year. Met my wife when we were 16. We both worked at McDonald's. We got married in our late 20s. We've got a beautiful 16-year-old daughter named Adelaide. And I've been pretty much in the northeastern Ohio area my whole life. Went to school in Lakewood, which is a suburb of Cleveland. And then we moved to Florida for a couple of years in our late 30s, but came back to Ohio. And that's really where we've really set our roots down is Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio.
Excellent. And when did you first start getting into reptiles, and what was that like?
Well, they say I was kind of born with it, and it goes. My interest in reptiles goes as far back as I can remember, and that was my first year of preschool. I remember probably that would have been about 1979. So I would have been only about 5 years old. And I remember taking a walk with preschoolers down in a nature area called the Metro Parks. And they said, be careful of stepping on turtles when we were crossing a little river stream. And I just remember getting super excited, like a bolt of energy just hit me. And that was one of my first memories with turtles and reptiles. But my mom and dad said that prior to that, I could catch birds and butterflies with my hands as a child and just get close enough to a bird and pick it up, or get close enough to a butterfly without using a net and just being able to gently pick it up without any kind of nets or capture equipment. So it goes as far back as I can consciously remember.
Yes, sir. Excellent. And then, so did you see any turtles that day on your adventure?
Not that day, but about a year after that, we had a box turtle, and I had that box turtle as the first actual reptile that we kept. So it was just a year after that. I think my parents saw the interest in reptiles, and it was a 3-toed box turtle that they bought probably at a pet store, something along the name of Dr. Pet, which used to be a mall pet store back in the day. So I had that 3-toed box turtle for probably about 10 years, but it started around 1980. And also very early on, a big portion of the interest, it was a very good combination of both nurture and nature. There was an innate interest in reptiles. I was born in 1974. In 1981, so we're still talking like first grade here, there was a reptile organization called NOAA, the Northern Ohio Association of Herpetologists. And I got enrolled. My parents bought a yearly membership for NOAA. It was really interesting. They'd have monthly meetings, a speaker down in Rock River Nature Center. Usually the attendance, because this is way before internet and whatnot, usually the attendance was somewhere between 30 to 100 people that would attend. And I would go down to the monthly meetings. Just mom and dad would take us down. I have 2 brothers. They weren't necessarily all that interested in animals, but I was able to network as a little kid, absorb these talks that world renowned uh, zoologists and people were giving. Learning the ins and outs of people's breeding of boas, and Tom Crutchfield's travel around the world, or Dr. Marty Rosenberg's studies on venom. So, as a very, very, very early child, I had the interest in reptiles fueled by monthly NOAA meetings.
Yeah. Well, and how great to have that resource as a young man coming into the hobby, just a young person in general, to have that guidance of those people. And did anybody really kind of take you under your wing, under their
Yeah,
wing in
yeah,
those
just
situations? Were there any
very, very
standouts?
early on, and that was a combination of two people founded NOAA, Chuck Vorchek and Norm Dam. Norm, of course, he's still alive, but he was really well known for breeding milk snakes. And Chuck was the Cleveland Zoo's education specialist. So you had a bit of a, and a lot of these guys were World War II vets, or the baby boomers were still kind of the younger generation. But you had a lot of structure, and you had a lot of cohesion with people learning about things for the first time. An emerald tree boa was a very exotic snake to try to learn, let alone breed. Uh, we had people come in and talk about, like Trooper Walsh would come in and talk about how he bred green tree pythons for the first time. So it was very, very, very informative on husbandry of the reptiles. I was exposed to just a bigger world, and as a child, my imagination just ran wild. And I remember going to the libraries, and at the time, the local libraries had about 4 books on snakes or reptiles. It was, you could look at the reptile section, and it was about 6 inches wide if you're lucky. But but it really fueled the mental growth in a certain direction.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Well, and that's such an interesting thing when you think about it, right? As the younger generations are coming up into the hobby, so much of the hobby now is internet based that you don't get that. Well, you don't get the camaraderie of a reptile club like that, where you're getting together and you're getting to discuss these ideas, and then also to the foresight of older members to go through and go, let's bring these people in to get to talk to those people. I'm sure there were many talks that were very interesting there. Do any of those talks really stand out to you, and something you remember where you go, this was a pinnacle moment in kind of my thought process of herpetoculture, reptile keeping?
Yeah, there sure were, and I'm just a young kid. I started NOAA. I was maybe 5 years old, and then as I was 1981, 1982, 1983. You're in first, second, third, fourth, fifth grade. Um, by third grade, I had already started keeping green iguana, garter snakes, the three-toed box turtle, uh, green anoles, a handful of painted turtles, snapping turtles, a handful of local, herps, local species, and then a couple of exotics, like the green iguana was very exotic. There was a reptile pet store named Parma Pets, which was all reptiles, and that was kind of a go-to area. And as NOAA developed, and I developed, going through early grade school. Yeah, the one talk from Tom Crutchfield, he had just come back from a trip over to from Asia. He had pictures of blue green tree pythons and giant water monitors, and Tom was at his height in terms of business with Crutchfield Herpetofonda. His talk was very, very, very interesting. And then the local guys all had very good specific. They weren't specialists like a lot of people are today. People had, they had everything. They'd have things from, and there was no laws back then against keeping venomous. And so there was one fellow named Dennis Crawhamel who was the vice president of NOAA off and on, but he had a 20-foot Burmese python in his living room named Tina, and it was this big giant cage. And I'd go over his house to get feeder mice, and he'd have gaboon vipers, he'd have dwarf crocodiles, he'd have Indian pythons, he'd have Egyptian cobras. He probably had 80 to 120 reptiles in his basement. That was tremendous as a little kid, seeing all those. And he was sometimes a little bit uh, kind of like he wanted me to focus on just a few things at a time. As a kid, you're bouncing all over the place, but he was also a very big influence. And then Chuck Vorchek, who was the education specialist at the Cleveland Zoo and a Mensa member, was also a very, very big person that was influenced in my life. And I was fortunate to be friends with Chuck, and all the way till he died about a decade ago or so.
Yes, sir. Yeah. No, and to have that insight with an experienced keeper that you go through, where how often do we see it where we see a person that's new to the hobby come in and they get the Noah's Ark syndrome,
Yeah.
right? Where they're going a million miles an hour and their collection turns out to be this hodgepodge of different animals, and over time it becomes overwhelming, and they lose the interest. And so to have someone that maybe has experienced that themselves, or then get to pass it on to you and go, hey, that's cool, but keep it focused, and focus on these individual animals.
Yeah.
How important that is.
So by uh, through the grade school, I was going to a Catholic grade school, St. Cyril's and Methodius in Lakewood. Um, I had kind of two kind of interests going. The reptiles were very large. We were still being able to go to the monthly meetings. My mom and dad, were really good about not suppressing an interest in snakes, even though my mom didn't really care for snakes. And my dad was very good at providing the structure of the caging and making sure that he was aware of what the animal's needs were. When I was just a little kid, just being excited about an animal, not necessarily. And remember, this is the early '80s. There's not a lot of information about nutrition, and I mean, it's been exploded so much more today than what we knew back then.
Yes, sir.
But the interest was in reptiles, and then there was a butterfly, a dried butterfly and insect shop in Parma called Butterflies and Things, and Chuck and Connie Iani were the owners of that. They had a dried insect business, a mail order business, and in Parma, Ohio, they had a a shop that you could go into and buy dried insects. These giant walking sticks or big moths that Atlas moths that are the size of a dinner plate. So for birthdays and Christmas, I was always able to get a big, ugly, giant dead bug in a case, and along with that, I'd have the live animals, the reptiles, and it's almost like fractal because today I've got the largest birdwing butterfly collection in the world of dried insects that was inspired by Connie and Chuck Iani, and then world well known for uh, the reptiles, in the terms of the crocodilians and the snakes and the travel and the conservation work with that. So I feel like somewhat fractal in that it started a pattern very early on,
Mm.
and it just that pattern just became larger and larger, but central themes are still intact.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's so interesting. And then you run into the people like that early on kind of find their focus and run with it, and then to have supportive parents that made the personal sacrifices and maybe comfort to facilitate you to do that, and then to see your life blossom into that, going, these are my focuses, and that being the undertow of what you're doing. It's super cool to hear. You know, you hear people talk about it, but then to do it and live it, it's very, very interesting.
And
You
it
know, and
becomes very interesting when people come over, and I rarely have guests. I don't have too many people coming over the house due to the valuable nature of these things. But when you see the butterfly collection or you see the reptile collection, people people talk about it for quite a while. And if there's a little kid that comes over and I inspire them, it goes both ways. There's been friends that have come over and their children have come over and seen things, and kids are maybe in fifth grade or sixth grade. And one instance was the little kid got in trouble because she came back and told her teacher all next week about all these crazy animals, and the teacher accused the little child of lying and gave her detention. And when her mom found out, there was hell to pay. But the teacher quickly found out that all of this was true, because I stay true. I stay true to myself, in that I stay true to the love of the animals and the interest. I never did it for financial gain. In fact, I appreciate a corn snake just as much as a very rare diamond python, and I try to be very generous with children and people. I never charge for animal shows. If somebody says, "Paul, could you do an animal show for Cub Scouts or for disabled children?" I never charge a dime. Never. It's always a yes. It's always free, and it's just a matter of scheduling it in.
yes, sir. Yeah. Well, that's a beautiful thing, and something where, again, you don't know what those pinnacle moments in that child's life, or even just adult in general, anybody's life. And so for you to recognize that and take the opportunity to spread that knowledge, it echoes and multiplies as when that kid's out at the playground, and instead of stomping on the lizard or killing the butterfly, there's now some appreciation for that animal, and that person goes on and spreads that, from a young age to where I am now, and the conversations I have with people. It seems like there's an overall more acceptance for reptiles in the wild, and why you still run into the only good snake is a dead snake person.
Yeah.
Um it's it's lessening, I think, over time, and just that continued education, and you're partly responsible for that in your area and the people that you have your reach in, and especially throughout your career, and the people coming to the zoo to check out what you're doing, and to take that opportunity to educate those people. How does that echo and multiply?
Yeah. So we're kind of still at about the grade school level.
Yes,
You,
sir.
you know, at in grades, in early grades, sixth, seventh grade, I was getting asked by Cub Scout moms to come and talk about reptiles, and so I learned how to public speak early on in front of folks. It's amazing what other side talents or what other side skills you acquire. So early on, it was easy to learn how to speak in front of a group, and have animals come in and speak in front of a classroom, because the nuns or the teachers would say, for this day, you're going to bring in your iguana and 5 cases of your insects and talk about that. So it became very fluid and very comfortable to talk about animals from early on, and to learn how to communicate, uh, which is very key. How do you spark someone's interest? How do you communicate on different levels, from being able to talk to an adult about uh, crocodilians, or being able to talk to a child about the value of the snakes in their backyard. And so you learn different layers of communication styles. And we go into high school, and I had already been on the local news a couple of times with animals from the zoo. And in high school, that's where I started to travel, first to Arizona, and then a little bit broader throughout the United States, keeping also with the theme that high school teachers, biology teachers were said, hey, can you bring your animals to class? And then it became, can you bring your animals in front of the whole school? And the school's almost 2,000 people, so you're filling an auditorium up, and it was just this very almost like talent that spiked without really looking back on it. It was so unique, but it was a way to create a bridge between learning and talking and socializing. So it became very much like a incubation for things later on.
Yes, sir. Yeah. And so early on, moving on in the hobby, and as you were collecting these animals and going out, and then like you just brought up your first trip to go field herping. I assume you're doing field herping locally throughout your.
Actually, it was a mission trip to with our local church to help construct homes on a Navajo reservation in Rough Rock, Arizona,
Okay.
through Willoughby Hills Friends Church. And in doing so, I was able to find all sorts of rattlesnakes and rare collared lizards, and but it kind of coincided with a couple of summers living on a Navajo reservation. The Navajo reservation that was in ninth and 10th grade, so still early on in the high school years, a freshman and a sophomore. But that also caused a separation from my family those summers, and culture shock, because it was living on an Indian reservation, which are very, very, uh, it's very extreme poverty in certain areas.
Yes, sir.
So it kind of broke, and it kind of shattered, uh, me internally on that. Plus, I had gotten beaten up on the reservation by teenagers when I was a teenager, just there, and
Mm.
that kind of caused a uh, shift in my life to really be self aware, and realize how finite life is, how short life is, and make the most of life every day or every week, to keep the energy of human beings concentrated and focused, and being able just to really not fear anything after that Indian reservation, after those years, summers looking for reptiles, but also being there on a humanitarian aspect, really, really just opened up the explorer and the adventurer.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah, the value as as a young man kind of coming into life and finding yourself in that situation where it's a it's a drastic change from what your reality, and to have it come in at that crucial age and time in your life where it could allow you to open up your mind and realize that there's differences than what you're used to. And then again, the undertowing line there being reptiles,
Yeah.
and to be able to get out in the field and to see those different animals, and again, the data wasn't there other than maybe a field guide that you had, or a talk that you had seen. How much of that is just new unexplored territory, and
And then
to be.
learning the Navajos, living with Navajo, and they would interpret nature differently than people did in Cleveland, Ohio. Much more respectful of nature, much more. Um, they could make an analogy between what an animal does and how a person treats another person, and so it gives a little bit of depth and spiritualism to the world around us, to other people, to how do you solve a conservation issue further downstream. You start with the local people, and things have to work on a local basis for a larger aggregate basis in many cases.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
For example, when we look at butterflies and farming in the Solomon Islands or in New Guinea, uh, the foreign entities can come in, and I'm jumping way ahead, but it ties back to learning about human nature and how to treat people and how to do things constructively. But an example would be, uh, you know, a Malaysian logging company can come in and they can meet the tribal chief on an island. They get the tribal chief to drink too much, and then after he's tipsy, he'll sign a contract where he's letting them cut down, a large portion of their forests, the rainforests, which is very unethical but legal.
Mm.
So, through finding value in the rainforest with insects and planting the right crops, and using nature almost as a way you can harvest it, it can very much deter those logging companies, because the tribe will be making more money on selling bugs than they would cutting down trees. Because, for example, they might get $50 to $100 for a pair of butterflies for a collector, and they're increasing the butterfly population by planting the right food plant. The butterfly is more of a crop, where each tree that they get cut down only gives them about $12 to $15. That's how little money they actually get from a logging company cutting down a tree that's 200 years old.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
So as I've gotten older in life, you realize that it's got to work. Conservation has to work for the local tribes or the local people first, and then everything has to set in that time frame. It's like a surgeon or a doctor. The physician's motto is first do no harm.
Yes, sir. Yeah. No, and that to have that foresight and kind of that early on experience, and to see what it blossoms into. Again, jumping way forward, but the value that that's bringing, where that's a realistic way to look at it, right? It's very easy to sit here and say, don't cut down your rainforest, don't take your resources, but how did we get to where we are now? Many of the countries that we reside in now, that's how we got to where we were, and then we got to the point where we could say, hey, we're not going to do that, and we're going to protect this. We're a few people did, and so these people in these impoverished areas, how do you tell them not to do that, right? It's not realistic when they're looking at their child or whatever it is. They're gonna do what they have to do, and so to have a practical solution for that there's a market for, and that it gets them to protect the resource. Unfortunately, if it doesn't have a monetary value, it's not worth anything to those people.
Yeah, and it's funny because that kind of parallels both the crocodile farming and the. I'm an appointed member of the crocodile specialist group. I was appointed about 20 years ago into the CSG, which has basically a model of sustainable usage, crocodile farming, uh, alleviate the wild population by farming captive crocodilians, selling them for their hides, mainly, to a lesser degree meat and things like that. But that money then can get refueled back into the community. It almost parallels very well with insect farming, where you can plant food plants for insects, increase the population, and the native people can sell those to collectors throughout the world, get a sustainable harvest for that. And those the crocodile specialist group's motto and insect farming is actually a very, very parallel in in what it wants to accomplish and how they go about accomplishing that has a lot of similarities.
Excellent. Yeah. And it's every once in a while, right? You're having a conversation where you go, oh, I want to dig more into this and follow this path, but then I also want to keep the format of kind of what we're trying to discuss. And so we'll just send it. And so the mindset to have to kind of realize that we need to have a monetary value there and to get resources out of that to get people to care about the nature that's around them. Was that something that you came up with, or did you step into this model and you go, hey, this is how we adapt it, or what part did you play in that?
There were a few very highly respected people in my life that I learned that from, that taught me that. And the first one was Tom Crutchfield. He ran a business, and although Tom's had his challenges, ultimately his thinking was very much in line where you can captive breed animals, reduce the strain on the wild, and the people in the countries of origins find some type of benefit from that, not destroying the environment, because they can pull. Keeping a rainforest pristine just isn't realistic. You've got to have some economic incentive for those people to have a sustainable life. And that goes back to the NOAA. When I first met Tom Crutchfield in 1984, I was in fourth grade. So Tom was a role model. The second role model was a friend named Dr. John Gabler. John was a surgeon. He was a medical doctor that started the Fort Rickey Zoo in Rome, New York as a hobby. And later he moved down to Eustis, Florida. John had a pair of dwarf crocodiles. And for my 10th grade birthday, my dad had bought me an alligator. The alligator turned out to be too big for me to handle as a teenager. I sold the alligator, bought a baby dwarf crocodile from Dennis, who had all those reptiles in Cleveland. And what it ultimately led to was John Gabler's down in Florida. He and I become pen pals. And it was beautiful because I was like 15 years old and John Gabler was like 63 years old. But he originally called me and said, I don't see many people selling an alligator, because I was selling it through the NOAA classified. But I says, well, the alligator's sold. I got a dwarf croc, and he happened to have a dwarf croc pair that was breeding. So we became really good friends over the years, almost like a surrogate family. Him and his wife and his children. I was almost adopted into their family. But he had been the first person to import binturongs into the country, which are like a large bear cat, and they smell real nice. They smell like popcorn, buttered popcorn. He had been friends with a fellow named Robert Bowdy, who I met on a few occasions, who was one of the biggest tiger breeders in the country. He was the original person to breed the white tiger. Robert Bowdy had a book on him called The Animal Man. He was a French person, very well known in the circuses and the zoos, but he was breeding clouded leopards, white tigers, jaguars, you name it. He had all sorts of cats. And John had been around the world. He had been to the Galapagos, and I still have the letters in a file cabinet. But we became pen pals, and it'd be, I talk old school, but you get a letter from someone, you handwrite it, and you handwrite a letter back. You never throw handwritten letters away. If you look, most people never will throw a handwritten letter out. So John was the second big influence, and we were friends for many, many years, up until his death. And then the third person was Chuck Vorchek, who was the education specialist at the zoo. And then I had worked animal care at the Cleveland Zoo through Chuck in my college years. So I graduated from high school. We've got all these animals. Once a year, there'd be a reptile fair at the Cleveland Zoo that lasted about a week and a half. People would bring their private reptiles to the zoo and display them because the zoo didn't have a reptile collection. I used to volunteer in the summers and help open up the reptile fair and close it down. And that led to working at the Cleveland Zoo through college, part time. But during that time in college, I was taking care of all of the animals in the Rainforest building, which is a 2 acre, $30 million building in 1988, $30 million to construct it. And the 2 acres, I took care of the animals on the first level. And that's really where I really got exposed to a lot of larger animals than just the hobby reptiles. We bred American crocodiles for 2 years in a row at the Cleveland Zoo. I was a college kid raising two Komodo dragons. We raised two Komodos from just 14 inches to about 7 feet. I had bushmasters and giant reticulated pythons. I got to take care of fly river turtles, occasionally an orangutan upstairs when the keeper was out sick. I'd take care of an orangutan, and a variety of birds, parrots, you name it, tapirs. But that rainforest building had a huge collection of reptiles. I think it was probably 300 when you counted them off exhibit and on exhibit. So that was kind of starting the college years, and then during college, both I'm going to school at Cleveland State for science, and the zoo in Cleveland State offered a trip to Venezuela to study three different types of animals. There were three groups. The first group was to study the primates in Venezuela, like the capuchins, spider monkeys. The second group was studying birds. And then I was with Hugh Quinn, who was the general curator at the zoo, and we were studying caimans and turtles. So that was another very, very wonderful experience of kind of the zoo and the university commingling, and then having being out in the field in the middle of the rain, not rainforest, but it was a dry forest, but in the middle of the jungle, studying real world animals. And you could get, I got bit by or stung by a scorpion one time, and it was very raw.
Yes, sir. Yeah. No, and that's so interesting to think about it. And there's so many points were made there, right? Where you think about a zoo having people bring their private collections in to show them off. It seems like that's a kind of a thing in Asia where their snake shows. They're more like a dog show, from what I've gathered, or some of them I don't know, but people are coming in, and so the pride in the animal to bring it in, and you don't see that nowadays. But
And you know what? You never saw. So this is before any ball python morph. This is before any. The most back then was about the albino corn snake or the albino California king snake. During this time, this is still in the early 90s and late 80s kind of thing with the reptile fair. You had a whole section of maybe 80 or 90 reptiles. They weren't what you see at the reptile shows for the most part. They were Madagascar big-headed turtles. They were Mexican indigo snakes. They were Massasauga rattlesnakes. They were Burmese pythons. They were rock iguanas. They were chuckawallas. They weren't the morphs that you see today. They were just you open a field guide of reptiles and pick one that you had 80 species of different reptiles, gaboon vipers, Gila monsters, and there was probably 10 or 15 people at NOAA that would bring those animals down and participate in that reptile fair, and then the public would come in, and I'd be giving talks on reptiles during that whole session, and that's what eventually led to my stint at the Cleveland Zoo. While I was a student, it just was it was still a very positive and healthy environment. A lot of those managers were, maybe still World War II, maybe born a little bit after, but they weren't smothering I was too young to know about the politics in zoos. All I kind of gathered was I had a lot of experience with animals that college kids really never had experience with.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
I can remember a Friday night in the middle of winter, hatching out a baby American crocodiles, or maybe it was like late fall, but it was chilly up in Cleveland. And I remember canceling a party. I was invited to go to a college party, and I said, "No, I'm busy Friday night. We think our crocodiles are going to hatch." And I thought, how cool is I was the only one in the zoo, only one in the rainforest with one keeper and I, and we're hand hatching little American crocodiles. I says, I'll take that over any normal college kid's social life any day.
Yes. Well, it's so interesting too, right? That enthusiasm of a young person going into the situation where, right, now I will say I agree with you 100% on this, but if we look at it and we apply it to a job setting, right? That we've always had the guy on our roster where we go, if I call him, I know he'll come in. It's not my first call, but I know he'll come in. And then you apply it to that where you go, there's so many people necessary to go, okay, cool. As long as I don't have to come in, that's awesome. He'll do it. Paul will come in. We'll just call him. We know he's going to sit here. We're good. Yeah. And but 100%, I agree with that. The beauty of that situation and to get to experience those moments. And so early on, you have a love for crocodilians and a foresight. And with that American alligator that your father got you, was that something that you said you wanted, or was that something your dad was like, hey, I'll knock this one out of the park?
Well, this is where the crocodiles really sparked. The crocodiles, I'd always been interested in reptiles, but the crocodiles in the early 90s, that's where the spark turned into a flame, and then it turned into a roaring fire later on. But what happened was I at Lakewood High School, I was able to do a whole animal display, and with my personal collection of animals, which at the time was probably 15 or so, we set it up in the school's library. But I didn't have an alligator, and alligators had just gotten declassified, so it was like the second year you could kind of keep them as pets.
Yes, sir.
The dentist fella had a 3-foot alligator. He said he'd loan it during the course of that week with the high school, and that having an alligator was huge. It was just that it took everything to a whole new level. I had to give that animal back to Dennis at the end of the week, and Dennis said, "Well, if you ever want it, I'll sell it to you." Well, that's when I approached my father, who said, "Absolutely not. You're not getting an alligator." So, of course, it was reasonable. I says, "All right, Dad, maybe a fish tank, saltwater fish tank. I don't just pulled something out of the air." And sure enough, down Christmas Day, there's a big, giant square box that looks like a fish tank. And I thought, oh, my dad got me a saltwater fish tank. It was like 100 gallon in size. Well, I opened up the wrapper, and that was a fiberglass tank that was a temporary cage, and there was a 3-foot alligator with tape around the snout. But it wasn't a friendly alligator. And so it was an alligator in its true form. And I had it for several months, and then I did come to the realization that it was more than I was ready for. A guy came out and bought it on a Harley Davidson who had caimans, so he was much older. And then I turned around and bought a baby, what's called Osteolaemus tetraspis, which is the African dwarf crocodile, and that little fella was all of maybe 13, 14 inches. And the dwarf crocs are real sweet. They're sweet as babies. You can handle them. They can tame as adults. Now I have probably the largest collection of dwarf crocodiles in the country. I have them spread out and whatnot, but I think I've got around 30 dwarf crocodiles. And that led to the friendship with John Gabler. And there's some very interesting things I'll just try to talk real briefly about, touch points. But I had the dwarf crocodile, the original one, and when I had the year after the Venezuela trip, I had it at my wife's apartment at the time. She was girlfriend, but my wife's apartment, because it was getting much bigger than my parents would allow. The animal bit a electrical cord and it died, and I was heartbroken. It was my own fault. I didn't have a ground fault interrupter. It was a big mistake that I had made, and the animal died. So John Gabler's wife, I talked to her about it, and what eventually happened was John Gabler sent me 2 dwarf crocodiles down from Florida that he had bred. He had sent me 2 babies, Leviathan and Clarence. After he sent those babies, John had a stroke, and he was in the hospital with a stroke, came out of the hospital. I flew down to see him. He said his quality of life had deteriorated. He took a gun to his head and he shot himself in the face, trying to commit suicide. It was successful suicide. He went back and had reconstructive surgery done. I flew back down again and got him a pair of baby Morlet's crocodiles because he still had his Florida permit. And I had a friend that had just hatched out Morlet's crocodiles. Got him 2 baby crocs. Hopefully, I was thinking it would give him something to live for, to take care of 2 little animals. About 2 months later, John's wife drives a friend of hers to the airport. John gives away the Morlet's crocodiles the day before, and then John commits suicide by carbon monoxide in his garage. When that happened, I didn't know he had died, but
yes, sir.
I had gotten married. Michelle and I were married by this time. It sounds really strange, but I was lying in my apartment bed. I have John's dwarf crocodiles taking up our bedroom. I'm living in a 900 square foot apartment. It's in August. The air conditioning's on. At 2 a.m, I go to turn off the air conditioning, and I look at the foot of my bed, and I see this John Gabler, and it as soon as I look at it, it forms like a green mist and disappears. And I turn the air conditioning off, and I wake up the next morning. The air is off so I know I wasn't completely dreaming. And I said, that was so strange. I said, I thought I saw Dr. Gabler last night at the foot of my bed. Well, lo and behold, later that day, I get a note in the mail from Lorraine Gabler, John's widow, that said, I didn't know how to tell you this, but John took his own life. I didn't want to call you. I figured, she wrote it in a letter. And that was the first time I had learned about his death. And at the same time, it was very, very unusual to have that experience. And I'm a science guy, so having something like that was very, very out of the norm.
Yeah.
Those 2 crocodiles, I grew up, and one of them is at the Brookfield Zoo today. It's one of the females. She's the Leviathan, has a mate at the Brookfield Zoo, and then the other one was down in St. Augustine. The St. Augustine animal, we were able to breed her over the years. We've got babies. And then the Brookfield Zoo, I get eggs and I hatch out those eggs as well. And that kind of symbolizes carrying John's spirit of crocodiles alive. And then on his, at the Fort Rickey Zoo, there's a grave site of John Gabler, because that's the zoo he started. And there's a pair of his adult dwarf crocodiles on that grave site, which actually his adults that had the babies that I have, which are now 20 some years old. Those adults, when he tried to kill himself the first time with the gun, it happened that those adults died in the cold because he was in Florida and he didn't plug in the heating units, and it was like December, and they chilled and they died.
Mm.
So all of this is very surreal to some degree, and it kind of keeps, it's part of the story of life that I have about why I got into crocodiles so passionately. And now, now I've got 70 crocodiles. They're spread throughout the country. The babies I keep at a facility and raise them up. I've helped the not only in the crocodile specialist group, but I've been to Australia collecting wild crocodiles via helicopter. Every year I go down to help the University of Florida. We collect baby American crocodiles and do research and mark the population down there. I go to the Solomon Islands and remove crocs from certain islands. So it's and then there's a project in Cameroon, Africa, where we survey and we're trying to get a crocodile farm started. So it all of this, like we talked about earlier, how things are like fractal in my world, in my life. All of this is connected, but it just becomes fractal. It's the same pattern. It just grows and gets larger. But the threads and the pattern has been very, very consistent.
Focused. Yes, sir. Yeah. Well, no, and that's the that aspect. While the story is tragic, but the path it set you on is an amazing part of herpetoculture, right? Where I was at the tail end of it and just had a particular interest in it, but to pick up the lineage of animals that continue on, right? And this is something that's come up a couple times where, right, you think of the commemoration of a loved one, whether, and let's say that person did something that is an art form or something, right? Whether it's a painting or a statue or a gravestone or whatever applies to that person's kind of attempt at immortalizing their existence in the reality that we're currently in, right?
Yeah.
That reptiles offer this, or not offer, but certain individuals will come and make their mark on the hobby or the species or however you want to quantify it, that is more valuable and more meaningful than a statue, right? The statue can be a beautiful piece of art or a painting, but once that piece of art is complete, it is present and it is there. But in reptiles, the time and the foresight that these individuals that we have a personal or a caring for, that their legacy continues in the form of a live animal with the people championing that person, right? Whether it's Applegate or Vivid Line or whatever it is, there's a name and a vision and a person committed to that animal, and it's beautiful. And what a way to commemorate somebody with not something that it's a perishable thing, so people take the effort to care for it and to cultivate it.
Yeah, it's like there's a spirit that moves it throughout time and place. It's a direction. It's a what do you call it? Like they would say an honor. It carries the person's honor through generations.
Yes, sir.
And then there was one other person that's been very instrumental, and that's been Dr. Graham Webb. Graham Webb was the chair of the Crocodile Specialist Group. I forgot to mention him earlier, but he's very well known in both Australia and globally, and what's called the IUCN, which is like a World Conservation Commission structure. So when we look at crocs, for instance, there's like a management team, the crocodile specialist group. There's a group of stakeholders, and the scientists, teachers, business owners, students, and those people have uh, an interest in the species crocodilians worldwide. They can influence how laws are made, how countries classify things, how commerce can happen, say with the skins. And so, but Graham was the chairman of the crocodile specialist group, and over in Darwin, Australia. So as I get further into the crocodilian uh, ecosystem, he was very, very instrumental in keeping not only personally inviting me into the crocodile specialist group, but giving me a clearer path on how to sustainably use these animals for um, both local individual people like the Aboriginals and the farmers, but also to not really anthropomorphize animals too much. There's a purpose that we can use these for a greater good.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Well, that's beautiful, and that was I think a wonderful way to get to the the answer to that question, and I love it, and that's what's so fun about all this. Well, just kind of things that popped into my mind that I feel like maybe you know or you don't know, and I would just be
Sure.
interested. When were some of the first dwarf caimans brought into the United States? How did that
Well,
happen? Are you aware of that?
these are dwarf crocodiles.
Sorry, again, I apologize. Yeah.
Yeah, that's okay. So there's about 27 species of crocodilians. They're using DNA to look at populations that used to be one population. Now they've split them in other populations. So the for the dwarf crocodile used to be uh, Osteolaemus is their Latin genus, and that simply translates to bony throated. Is osteo, and then laemus means bony throated because these little crocs have bony throats. Tetraspis refers to four shields that are on the back of the neck. They're called osteoderms.
Okay.
Tetra meaning four, four osteoderms, four shields. And then you had another type of dwarf crocodile called Osteolaemus osborni, which was further found further up in the northeastern part of the Congo, or used to be like Zaire. Now they've got another one that they've split on DNA called Osteolaemus alphazeri, and that's a different one. I've actually got alphazeri and Tetraspis in the country. People didn't know at the time. They looked a little bit different. Like a red-tailed boa looks a little different than, say, a Colombian common boa, but uh, not a lot of people could kind of train their eyes to see the differences, especially when they're adults, because they really do look a lot alike. But the snouts are different, the scalation's different. They both of them were brought in mostly pre-CITES, from what my understanding is. So they have been here a long time. Those dwarf crocs will live 70 years, 80 years, maybe even up to 100 years. They think one in Chicago lived 100 years. So they've been here a long time. And so what we have in the U.S. pretty much is it. There have been a couple of people I know that have been able to import them in the 80s over from Europe to have new blood. But Fish and Wildlife is pretty strict on that because they're considered what's called a CITES 1 Appendix 1 animal. And that basically means that they have the highest level of international regulations to move them across not only state lines, but country lines. So I started with one dwarf crocodile in '93, and that's the one that died. And then I had gotten two dwarf crocodiles from John Gabler after that. And then since then, I've worked with both the zoos that have had them and the private sector. And that uh, level I'm at now is where we've got breeding pairs established throughout different parts of the country, and that's a species that I kind of champion. It's because of the relationship with John, because of the interest, and we did have them at the rainforest. I forgot to mention that not only did we have the big American crocs, but we had two small dwarf crocodiles from the Woodland Park Zoo in Seattle. So that was always a joy to have little dwarfs as well. But I champion that species because it has an emotional connection to somebody in the real world, or to somebody that was important growing up.
Yes, sir. With crocodilian keeping, right? I think it's something that probably the average person that picks up one of these species at a show, um, it's probably not good for the animal long term, and
Well, let me say this. Let me say it this way. It's a loaded question. Partially now, most of the crocodilians coming into the country are the two types of dwarf caiman. So you have Paleosuchus, which means old caiman or old crocodile, Latin. You have the Palpebrosus and the Trigonotus. Trigonotus gets a little bit bigger, but both of those species are around 4 to maybe 6 feet. The American alligators do not make good pets if you don't have the space for a 9 or 10 foot, animal. But most of the pet shop varieties are the dwarf caimans now that you see predominantly. And a female of those species is really going to be hovering around 3.5 feet. So it's not unreasonable. For instance, a water monitor or some of these monitor lizards or iguanas will actually get much bigger than a dwarf caiman will. The but So I think that the dwarf caimans are very good for people that want to keep a crocodilian. They're not terribly large. Uh, the Palpebrosus, with a lot of training, can actually be a fairly tractable animal. They can train well. The trigs don't train well, but the palps do. Then you have a price point. That's typically in a pet store setting. They're a $400 to $500 animal. Wholesale, they're about half that. But if you're going to go out and buy a crocodilian, you're going to spend $500. You're probably going to get a dwarf caiman 90% of the time. A lot of states have outlawed alligators, and alligators aren't quite as common in the pet trade. And the ones that are in the pet trade, uh, you do see them occasionally. Somebody drops them off in a lake, but for the most part, there's enough dedicated individuals that will take a alligator that's gotten too big, and they'll move it down to one of the alligator parks in Florida, like Gatorland or Alligator Adventure. Back when I was doing it in Cleveland, alligators were okay to have in Ohio at the time. I would get about 2 to 3 alligators a year, and it's just at that point where they go from being able to fit in an aquarium to having to go into a room size enclosure. That's
Yes, sir.
that's about the 3.5 foot mark where people make a decision. But they call the local zoo. Local zoo calls me, and then I'm making milk runs down to these alligator farm or alligator zoos, twice a year. So it's no problem, at least in Ohio. In Pennsylvania, there's a fella that will also take alligators and put them in a safe home, and he's got unlimited resources. So I would say that it's probably comparable to large constrictors and maybe large lizards more now than it has in the past.
Yes, sir. And that was my question. Where in the hobby, from the early on kind of keeping that you saw to what you see now? Do you see an evolution in people keeping and it being more responsible and moving towards a path where a person like yourself that has a high level of keeping would feel is more appropriate for the species than early
Yeah,
on?
I think it's kind of funny that the people in the South that like are in South Carolina have the space to keep the bigger crocodilians. They do a pretty good job. Texas is a hot spot. Like, people that keep crocs in Texas, South Carolina, Florida generally do a pretty good job because space isn't really a limiting factor. They can keep them on 10 acres and they can set up ponds and maybe circle the ponds with a fence or whatnot, or whatever the regulations are in the state. So in what I've seen in the last 10 years is that generally it's pretty good. Now it's not perfect, but uh, the people are much more. They've had Steve Irwin when they were a kid watching Steve Irwin, so the amount of interest has expanded over the decades. Prior to Steve Irwin, no, it was like you maybe had a common caiman, or maybe you had a crocodilian if you were down in Florida, but it's a lot more widespread now than it was 20 years ago. Probably mostly due to Animal Planet and Steve Irwin.
Well, and that's such an interesting fact, right? Is to think about, right? Like if I think of a snake cage in my head, the earliest idea of what a snake cage would be, it would be one of the right the formed. I can't remember why. I'm so disappointed. I can't remember that.
Yeah, like
Neodesha cages.
Yeah,
Yes, sir. Yes, right. With the kind of weird, like this is meant to be stuck in a wall,
yeah,
and that would be my thought of a snake cage. But then to apply that to a crocodilian, again, also I'm completely ignorant to the crocodilian world. I've never kept anything. I
yeah.
it's like, oh, that's cool, but not for me.
Yeah, it's a bit of a cult following. Like, the dwarf caimans have been very good for the hobby. On one level, they come out of Guyana, and there's a quota system, so they're allowed to collect the babies, and then 90% of the babies would die in the wild. So collecting hatchling dwarf caiman. When I say dwarf caimans, I'm referring to both species, the trigs and the palps. So that runs a quota, and they typically ship them out of Guyana November, December, January, and then the quota's done. Baby season's over, and those are a good choice for a pet. If somebody's at the level of, I would say it'd be at the same level of the first time they keep a Burmese python, the first time they keep a water monitor, maybe just about a level up from maybe a rhino iguana. But it's kind of like if they can keep monitor lizards, bigger monitors, Nile monitors, water monitors, types of things, then dwarf caimans are a pretty good level. Where it's and dwarf caimans are also kind of like $500, so it's not like any kid can just go out and afford one. $500. They're kind of sensitive, so if their care isn't right, they're not real hardy if their parameters aren't met. So if they're kept too cold, they're going to get fungal infections on their skin. Typically, they're going to die. If they're kept in the mid or upper 80s, they'll do pretty well. But they're basically a intermediate to slightly advanced species, knowledge-wise, to take care of. And I think that's a good thing. That means that there's some barriers to somebody wanting one. It's not a animal that's like a green iguana that will get big and you can get it for $15 to $20.
Yes.
It's an animal that you have to set it up right. You have to kind of get your experience and then go towards it. and then I've got people that train them very well, and they're on voice command, and they can hold them. So I would say that they're a good intermediate to slightly advanced reptile to keep. They're not for everybody. They live a long time. Crocodilians live about what people live. A smaller crocodilian will live maybe 30 to 50 years. Bigger ones will live 70 to 100 years. Now, the people that keep the larger crocodilians, you have a couple of things going for them. They have state regulations. They have federal regulations on moving them across state lines. And typically, if they're going to keep the smaller crocodilians, I think there's a fair amount of larger facilities throughout the country that can help in unwanted animals. Again, not perfect. Nothing is perfect, but it's not bad. If somebody really has an alligator that's outgrown them, they go on Facebook in an alligator group and they say, "Hey, this wasn't a right choice." They'll get roasted, but out of that roasting, there'll be somebody that says, "Hey, call X and such in Texas. He can take them or rescue them, or call somebody in PA that can take them. They've got a large facility in Florida," and that seems to be more commonplace than it was when we were young. And somebody would get a caiman, and then it would end up, in a dumpster.
Yeah. No, and I think that speaks to the maybe inherent difficulty in propagating the species, right? Where the average person isn't going to achieve it. So when you look at some of the larger constrictors that are relatively easy to propagate, that you're going to get a glut of those animals. And I think it's an unfortunate reality of modern day keeping, where how often do you see a picture of a full-grown reticulated python posted online?
Right.
Very rarely do you actually see that. You see the about 10-foot max. I'm not saying you don't see it, and I'm not saying there aren't people that are responsibly keeping these animals. It's definitely happening, but you're gonna see you don't see them. You don't see them, right? And so I think that's a beauty where, I remember being a young kid going into a local snake show and being able to buy green anacondas for $100. Right.
Yeah,
Now that's a wild caught animal,
yeah.
and they didn't do good, right? And
Yeah,
sorry,
and just one small minor thing about crocs is weird. Crocs have a high degree of plasticity in their growth. And we see this a lot with people that keep them up north versus when you move them down south. Somebody will get an alligator up north, say New England, and the alligator's 20 years old and it's 4 feet long. Way stunted that for what it normally should be. But this is the crazy thing about crocodilians is they have growth plasticity like some fish do. That same 20-year-old 4-foot crocodile from Rhode Island goes down to South Carolina at an alligator zoo, starts getting fed, and the first year it may grow a foot. The second year it grows 4 feet. And by 5 years down the road, that 4-foot, 20-year-old alligator is pretty much a normal size as the ones that were grown down, from day one. And that's kind of a strange thing with crocs is they show that, and that's part of why the farms spend a lot of money on optimizing food, temperature, to some degree genetics, and sex. Males grow faster than females. So a crocodile farm is a for-profit entity. It wants to get the biggest, best skin in the least amount of time and energy, resources put in. So these croc farms can grow, a saltwater crocodile to 6 feet long in, 2 years. Or an alligator, they can grow an alligator like 4 feet the first 2 years, and then maybe the next year it only grows a foot and a half. And there's a curve you could graph on the ideal size and resources that you've put into that animal, and that's usually, that curve is usually where they get, that's the calling size. That's where they call them for the leather. So that's kind of a weird, that kind of like throws a curveball in the crocs. It's a little different than the snakes and a little different than in the lizards. Is we get these rescue animals that are, they had them since they were kids, or they had them since they were in high school, and you get them and they're 20 years old or 15 years old, and they're these pint little things. You put them outside, you give them the right resources, and they just stretch out like Stretch Armstrong.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Well, no, and that speaks to why that species has kept going for as long as it has, right?
Yeah.
And beautiful. It really does speak to it.
Yeah, it's really kind of cool how it happens. It is, I had one in particular. The zoo called me, and I brought this alligator down that was it was like one of these drug busts things, and I've got some old Facebook photos of it because all the Cleveland police came, and originally they didn't want to touch it. I caught it. It's this, like I said, it's this 4-foot animal, but I'm surrounded by Cleveland policemen wanting to get a photo of it. Once I bandaged it all up on East 55th and St. Clair, in the middle of Cleveland, this alligator was walking down the city. And the chief of police and I stayed in contact for a few years after that because he'd want to see what the alligator turned out to be. And I showed him 2 years after that. I got a picture from the place, and this alligator is 7.5, 8 feet long.
Well, I mean, that's one, hilarious, right? You find yourself in this situation where you go, how did I end up here? But
Yeah.
okay, I'm the person you call. Crazy. But then also too, just again, the ability of that animal to do that's amazing.
Yeah.
So,
but yeah, are they for everybody? No.
No.
Yeah. Are they a good starter animal? No, they're neither can be a German Shepherd. Don't, not that I would say German Shepherds aren't good for little kids, but I'd say it may not be the best choice for somebody, or if you're living in an apartment. Now, dwarf croc, yeah, an apartment dwarf croc is fine as long as you don't mind sleeping in the living room and it takes up your bedroom. But they're I think that people should be allowed to keep them overall.
Yes.
But I think that you should keep some regulations and parameters. And the animal has to have a certain amount of needs that are met, a certain amount of enrichment, a certain amount of quality of life. And those have to be met, and they're met. Then that person should be able to choose if they can have one. And I think that's a very fair statement.
Yes, sir. Well, no, and that's something where I completely agree with that, right? I think that we should be able to keep whatever we want, and there's going to be, right, I don't think we should ever live by the lowest common denominator, and it's an unfortunate reality of human beings is that some people are shit, yeah. and they shouldn't keep anything, they shouldn't do anything, that and it's unfortunate, but that you should have the ability to keep whatever you want. What are some of the, especially moving on in time and where we're at and the amount of data that's available to the average person via Google or whatever, what are some good resources where people coming into not only not the reptile hobby in general, but crocodilians, what are good resources to kind of point those people towards to
Sure.
either set themselves up for it, or once they've made the decision, they have it, and now they're trying to do the right thing? Where are good places to point those people?
Yeah, I think I could give you a couple of tiers. The first tier is social media has changed everything in the herp community, right? So, getting on Facebook and joining a handful of groups that are crocodile groups. That's your first level. A lot of the information can be background noise, but it'll expose you to some good things in that. The second is to certainly read a lot online and watch YouTube videos, care videos. But then I always encourage people to network. There's zoo organizations you can join, like the ZAA. You can also join membership of the AZA. And that will give you newsletters. And although it won't be croc specific, you'll start being able to see where people keep crocodiles eventually. And you can go to those facilities. Some of them will be in your state, some won't. But if you're traveling and say, oh, I'm a ZAA member, I see you're also a ZAA member. Now you've got a connection. Now it's, now you're in a group. You can further go to, there's Croc Fest, which is a really good place to network. Croc Fest is generally in Florida twice a year. It's sometimes in St. Augustine Alligator Farm. Other times it's at Wild Florida, or it might be at like Zoo Miami or Lowry Park Zoo. They had one in Texas, I believe, this last year. Croc Fest is really, really good to network because you'll go there for it's only one day every 6 months, but you'll have exposure to crocodile biologists, crocodile zookeepers, crocodile enthusiasts. It's one of the few times where the zoos, the scientists, the private sector, the up and coming kids that really are just little kids that want to, get involved. And, like I was, 5th grade, 6th grade. Croc Fest is a great place to learn about the community of crocodilians. And then you can also get the Crocodile Specialist Group newsletter. I don't think you have to be an appointed member, but you can still get the newsletter, and that will show you all what's happening around the world with different crocs. And then the final thing I would say is your university generally has a biology department. If you're in college or you go to high school, and your biology teacher can say, yeah, you can see this professor, he's really good. Sometimes those college guys will take a student that's really interested in a particular thing, and they'll nurture them along. So the universities, Croc Fest, the zoo community, the private sector, which generally meets on, through Facebook, you can start picking out people that are maybe more regular than others. And then just networking and asking around. And that's because crocs are not really as mainstream as the other groups of reptiles, especially like I didn't always consider myself in the crocodile section. I didn't consider it hardcore hobbyist like if we were breeding carpet pythons. It was more the zoos, the universities, and the crocodile parks, and some private individuals. It's kind of a different, Lewis, it's kind of a different circle. It intersects a little bit, but really in its core, the crocodile folks are a different set of like it's a different set of community ecosystem.
100%. But I think, honestly, I think that that's ultimately the best for the animals themselves.
Yeah, they're not for everybody. And
no, right. And I think that, right. You explained it wonderfully and eloquently in the way you did. But I'm in 100% agreement where it's not for everybody, but the cream rises to the top.
Yeah.
Right.
Like and just a little bit of credentials, just which we didn't talk. I had a captive bred wildlife permit for every species of crocodilian. That was a federal permit issued. Very tough to get, but I had a federal permit in place with the credentials of crocodilians, and then I had other snakes and other reptiles. But that's a permit you need just to buy one across state lines. Second, Second is I'm a professional fellow of the ZAA, and I follow an accreditation parameters with that organization. I'm also in the crocodile specialist group, which is a little more broad, and then I still do field work with different universities or different scientists. So it's a little bit further than the weekend reptile shows where you're kind of sitting at a table, talking about breeding snakes. There's wild conservation, there's government, there's science, there's university, there's a variety of different other aspects than like a weekend hobbyist.
Yes, sir. Yeah. No, and that's completely understandable when you think about, right. I think that that's something that comes up in modern day herpetoculture is legislation that might come down on a species or a state, and from a just a right. I've not publicly spoken about it or thought about it, but when you think about kind of what legislation you think we should have as keepers or not have, that I don't like it. I don't like the idea of it. But then when you see something like, right, the crocodilian hobby, where you guys are very focused on what you're doing and
Yeah,
and what it takes to keep that animal legally and propagate it and move it forward, that's if you care about the animal, the individual species, that's probably better for that animal within reason, right? It doesn't need to be applied to everything, but
yeah,
for some things, maybe.
and I realize the animals that I keep, and I have 9 species of crocodilians spread through the country now. Some are in breeding groups that need to be in breeding groups. Others aren't. Others are a little more common. Others are a little more on the rare side. Um, I realize a couple of things that there's a very, very, very low probability that any of those animals or their offspring would ever be released in the wild.
Mm.
So I can't argue that there's any real conservation value to those captive animals, with the exception of the invisible arc. But if you keep Cuban crocodiles and there's an embargo on Cuba, it's not like you're going to be shipping babies back. Um, the second is the great thing about the crocodilians, though, is even though you can appreciate your own animals, you can really appreciate sometimes working with those animals in the wild. And that's where like the croc specialist group is really good, or some of the university croc docs are really good. Is you could sign up as a volunteer, or you could sign up if you're a student, and you could actually do real field work, and that actually is helping the crocodilians in the wild. You're maybe surveying nests, or you're looking at pollutants in the field and how that affects the reproductive rates of those animals. So the part of that aspect is very fulfilling, and so when you do get interested in these groups of animals, it doesn't mean you're limited to just a keeper. You can do all sorts of things that are related to these, with still being centralized, focused on the types of animals that you're interested in.
Yes, sir. Yeah, for sure. No, that's so interesting, and I think for the most part tonight, I think we really just got up to your time in college. So there's so much for us to continue to cover, and get into your career in the zoo field and so much more. But I think, again, being respectful of your time for the night and
Well, thank you.
everything else, I think we'll have to plan to do this again, and we'll have to pick up from your college time on forward, and that's something where going through and getting the opportunity to edit these conversations, where
Sure.
right when I listen to this conversation again, it'll be in a month to maybe a month and a half, and I'm gonna go through and I'm gonna listen, and I'm just going to be writing stuff down, going, well, okay, I should have asked this, and I should have asked that,
Oh,
and there's so many things. So hopefully, we get to do this again in the future,
y-
and
yeah, I'd love to. One other quick thing before we go,
yes, sir.
I'm even taking online college level classes, graduate level classes. 2 years ago, I took one on how to incubate crocodile eggs better, and it was out of the University of Darwin in Australia. Dr. Sally Eisberg wrote up the course curriculum and runs the class. And I don't know everything about incubating crocodile eggs. You take a class, and it talks about the parameters of how high the humidity needs to be, how high the surface moisture touching the egg, the temperatures, and if you go below these thresholds, you're going to get a much lower hatch rate. So even now, I'm still taking classes, formal university classes. Now, granted, you gotta pull them from all the different countries. They're not always in the U.S., but regardless, there's still a lot to be learned. And she's having me write up a paper about the specifics of what I'm doing with these, incubating these eggs, because there's still gaps in our knowledge about this particular species.
Yes, sir. Yeah, and that's, again, it's beautiful, and the idea to continue your education, and anybody that, whether you're keeping corn snakes or anything else, I implore you to go and to research as much as you can, because the information that might be focused on a saltwater crocodile in a farm, the data that you get from that you can apply to the species that you're keeping, if you're genuinely interested in it, who knows what that leads you as the individual to learn. So, keep educating yourself, even if it's on species that you don't necessarily plan on keeping
Yeah.
or anything else, because it applies to this animal. It evolved over millions of years to be what it is, and there's some overlap there. So there's always information to learn.
Yeah. Next time, I'd love to get in more. I know we covered a lot back and forth. I'd love next time to talk to you about some of the specifics I'm learning about incubating eggs and the mistakes that I made early on. It's almost like you're engineering a car engine. The tighter you can get all your parameters, the better results of hatching these eggs are. And I've been seeing this over the last couple of years that I've been hatching my own eggs in controlled environments here, that I've seen a progression in success from early on, some simple mistakes that were made, taking these classes, getting more information, recording all the data better and the parameters of incubating, and then learning as that's taken place, the success rate of hatching has increased. And something just as easy, I'll leave you with this, is when crocodile eggs are due to hatch, sometimes they'll chirp out of the egg so you can hear that the egg is ready to hatch.
Mm.
And Mama Croc will come and she'll open up those eggs. So this year was the first year that I heard one of the babies calling out to hatch. And you run the risk of the other eggs, if you open the other eggs up. Well, first of all, you open that egg up because it's ready to go. It pops out of the egg. You run the risk of not opening up the eggs and the embryos dying in the eggs, suffocating because they can't cut through the eggshell, versus do you open them up and then their bellies are bloated because the yolks haven't been absorbed yet. In the wild, eggs are incubated typically in high acidic soil, like with a lot of tannic acid. So that tannic acid, or that acid in the soil, degrades the calcium over time. In the wild, when those eggs are ready to hatch, those eggs are paper thin. But when we
Excellent.
hatch them in vermiculite, those eggs are still pretty hard shelled, and those babies can't get through that secondary membrane.
Ah, that's beautiful. I love it. I
and and,
love it.
and so I got better at, and this is talking to veterinarians and doctors and crocodile specialist groups. But the technique I did this time was, when that first baby hatched, popped out of the egg. And then I learned that crocodile eggs have two membranes in their shells. They have a hard outer membrane, which is like about 5 times thicker than a chicken egg. And then they have that inner leathery membrane, which is like a snake egg. What I learned to do is carefully take my thumb and crack open the outer hard shell membrane to about the size of maybe like between $0.25 and $0.50 on the egg. And that little baby will take the egg tooth and they'll be moving back and forth, and they can cut that smaller leather membrane and breathe and come out. And I nailed it this year with about 60% success, meaning I hatched out 4 babies perfectly.
Wow. Well, and that's one of those things is, so my main species that I keep that I dork out about is Lamprepeltis alterna.
Oh yeah.
So gray banded, that's my real, ooh, I love them.
Yeah.
And so, right, there's quite a few issues that you get with baby alterna, right? And
like feeding.
feed. I got my own little routine that I run, and I'm very confident in my getting an alterna to eat. But I made plenty of mistakes before I got to that. But that is that information where you go, okay, right, as you're speaking about the tannins and the leaf litter and what that's doing to the egg, I'm already thinking about, oh, how can I apply that to alternative? Where, okay, I don't think there necessarily is one, but that could happen, and so how do we apply that and think about that when we're so often to anthropomorphize reptiles? But when you hear data like that and to think about that synergistic effect between where the animals would naturally keep their eggs and to see how it applies over millions of years of evolution, again, it's valuable, and it adds a new lens to think about for the individual species you're keeping.
Yeah, it's almost like getting tribal knowledge is what I call it.
100%.
Meaning
Yes,
that,
sir.
maybe it's not in a book yet. Maybe it is, but it's talking to people that have kind of gone through it, made the mistakes, and then they share that knowledge with you. And I've got to kind of publish it and write it down because I've been taking real good notes on everything else, with incubating this species. And I'm finding even it's new ground. I can't find any information for the questions I'm asking out there. The people are like, we don't know. This is our closest analogy is a caiman or an alligator. We don't really know about the dwarf croc. So it's been finding people that have hatched them out and getting their insight, and really scanning scientific papers on like species, and then C, actually taking classes from universities that specialize in this sort of field.
Yes, sir. And that's the whole point, though, right? Is again where as humans we're so quick to anthropomorphize things, right? When you're talking to soccer mom Sally that has the ball python and she's going, it's not eating, and I think it's depressed because it's in its hide box, or whatever that applies to the average person, that's coming in contact with these animals. That learning little tidbits of data like that you just shared. That it widens the lens that I will apply to my reptile keeping for the rest of my life, where you go, okay, I already thought about the natural environment these animals are in, but here is a correlating factor that applies to these animals' success in the wild that we're not representing in our hobby. And so, okay, that's a downside to a sterile environment, a this, a that, a controlled. And you wouldn't think about it when you go, I'm hitting every parameter that the temperature's telling me.
Yeah.
But if you don't have an interest in plants or composting, you wouldn't think about those different pegs.
Yeah. One just quick. So when we look at American crocodiles in the wild down in Flamingo Bay, and then the northern Keys. I go down with the university professors and graduate students and PhD students, and we survey the babies right as they're hatching. A lot of times, we're right at that week where they're coming out of the egg. It's a magical time. It's generally either late July or early August. And that area in Florida has different soils. It has sand. It has another type of soil. I can't recall the name of it, but it's a little more like a clay mixed with sand. And then it's got some soil that's a little bit harder, like a rocky pebble. And the eggs, even though the ambient humidity is the same, when the female lays her nest in the cavity, she'll kind of use her back legs, and then the eggs get deposited and then covered over. Even though the ambient humidity is the same, certain clutches won't hatch because the surface moisture from the clay soil doesn't penetrate the egg like it does in, say, the sand. And they're finding that the eggs that are laid in the clutch that might have a clay type of substrate, the moisture just isn't penetrating, and they get a lot less babies that hatch successfully. So so the professor was saying you gotta look at surface moisture contact instead of humidity, which I didn't know till last year. I was, oh man, my humidity is way up, but the surface moisture is not correct. So now I put damp sphagnum moss so the eggs can actually touch, and then you have to worry about gas and airflow. Each egg needs 0.62 liters of air coming in so it can breathe. And if you've got bad eggs, it's going to release gases. And then your substrate and your eggs, you've got to compensate mathematically for enough airflow per egg, along with surface moisture, along with temperature, and all of this stuff is kind of like juggling balls. But the details are a lot of fun to work out. And then you've got temperature, and you'll see that more eggs will hatch at a certain temperature. It's like a distribution. At a certain temperature and all the parameters with humidity and everything, you can still graph that there's like a prime area where you'll get not only males and females, because they're crocodiles are sexes are based off of temperature of the eggs, but there'll be a curve where an ideal temperature is where more babies will hatch there than, say, 3 degrees or 4 degrees hotter or 3 or 4 degrees cooler. And I'm finding that it's all very, very fascinating, but it really feels like you're juggling a couple of balls while you're on a unicycle with all these parameters.
Yes, sir. Yeah. No. Right. That's the haunting factor to field herping and reptile keeping, especially when you get to a level like yourself, where, right, you go out one night and you see a million animals, and then on paper, with every tool I have, the parameters are the same tonight, and I'm not seeing that same movement in that species, and it'll lead to a million hours of conversations in the car where you're asking the same question 500 times the same, but a different way, but it's the same answer where you go, damn, I don't know. So beautiful. Well, excellent. Again, thank you so much for your time, and I cannot wait to do this again with you, and I think we'll have a million other questions and to finish your time. So again, thank you so much, Paul. I appreciate your time, and it was wonderful speaking with you.
Lewis, it's been a pleasure.
Let me zoom out on you here. Okay, you got a message for the time capsule?
Yeah, and it's simply this. My prediction for you is that even though you'll forget all about this in some way consciously, next summer at about this time, you'll remember to return.